Alright, we talked before about Bismarck, the unification of Germany. So I want to talk now about the decline of the Austrian Empire. Now, the thing you need to understand about the Austrian Empire is it wasn't made up of just Austrians or just people speaking German or any other one language. In fact, less than a quarter of them even spoke German, which is the language of Austria. As you can see from the map, there were a lot of different groups all crammed together in this empire. And it really was an empire. It was a bunch of countries held together. They had a couple things in common. They were held together by... really, they had very little in common. They were held together by the emperor and by military force. And that was really about it. So as long as you had a strong emperor and a strong empire, they were able to keep all these countries together. But they really didn't like each other. They really didn't get along with each other. They really didn't understand each other. They had different languages, different customs, different traditions, different religions. After the Austrian Empire lost to Prussia, Prussia forced them to change themselves to what was called a dual monarchy, the Empire of Austria-Hungary. So the Austrian Empire became the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or the Empire of Austria-Hungary. And Austria had, and Hungary had the same emperor, the same military and foreign affairs, but otherwise different laws. What are some of the different groups then in Austria-Hungary? Well, about 60% of the empire, 3/5, was made up of what they call the Slavic people. Now this is like an overall branching, overall ethnic classification. To say somebody is Slavic, it's not a good comparison, but it's kind of like saying they're Hispanic. You know, say somebody's Hispanic, well, what does that mean? It could mean that they're Mexican, Colombian, Salvadoran, whatever. To say somebody's Slavic, it could mean that they're Serbian, Croatian, Albanian, and so on. So there are a lot of different Slavs out there. They had this one thing in common, that they were roughly, kind of pseudo-related, and that they were Slavic people, but they really were their own people. Well, these Slavic groups didn't exist just in the Austro-Hungarian Empire anyway. They also existed as part of the neighboring Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, as you can see on the map, used to consist of the Ottoman Empire, which is the little piece of it you can see there on the map, plus all of that white used to be part of the Ottoman Empire. Well, the Ottoman Empire was what they called a sick man of Europe. It had, for various reasons we're not going to get into, had been on decline for quite a while. They didn't have the influence, the power, the administrative ability that they once had. So they began to lose pieces of their empire, particularly pieces of their empire in Europe. And so little by little, places like Bulgaria and Serbia, Macedonia and Bosnia all began to break away and seek their own independence. Well, the Austro-Hungarian Empire gobbled up some of these. They gobbled up Bosnia and Herzegovina, and this created a lot of tension. Because one of the things is that there's a lot, these groups are not all neatly in one place. They're spread out. So you find Serbs in Croatia, you find Serbs in Montenegro, you find Serbs in Bosnia, and so on. So because of all these spread out forces here, you get a lot of different cross-border tensions going on. In fact, this area was so tense, with all these different ethnic groups, always in conflict, always fighting over the same territory, that it was like a, powder keg about to explode. It was like an explosion just sort of waiting to happen. The Croats didn't like the Serbs, who didn't like the Bosnians, who didn't like the Bulgarians, who didn't like the Macedonians, and so on and so forth. And they were just itching for a fight. They only needed something to set them off, which is why they called it a powder keg. It was like a pile of gas, a barrel of gasoline waiting for a match to explode. Let's move on to Russia. Let's move away from Austria-Hungary and move into Russia. Russia of the 19th century, for lack of a better word, has to be called, I guess, just call them inconsistent. And I call them inconsistent because Russia could not quite seem to make up its mind. Did they want to maintain an autocracy, or do they want to reform? Autocracy is ruled by one person who basically makes all the decisions, calls all the shots, and this would be the Tsar. He was the autocrat. Whatever he said went, pretty much. There was no really legislature to restrict him. And whatever he wanted to do, he did. That's autocracy. The problem is that this was really an old way to sort of structure your government, and Russia was really in need of a lot of reform. And so they, felt like they needed reform, but they didn't really want to give up their autocracy, so they were in this conflict. And a couple of events that happened sort of forced them in different directions. For example, there was this thing called Decembrist revolt. After Alexander I died, Russian military officers attempted to sort of take over the government and install Western liberalism. And that Western liberalism, we mean like sort of a free and a government with a legislature, with parliaments, with voting, with some rights of owning property and rights of actions and rights of speech and so on. They wanted to install this. And that meant, basically taking power away from the Tsar. And the new Tsar wasn't going to have any of that. He did not like the idea that they were going to try to take away his power. So he eventually was able to put down the revolt with some loyalist military forces. And this Tsar was Nicholas I. So Nicholas I felt threatened by change, and so he put it down and refused to allow any change. He opposed liberalism whenever possible. He cracked down on anybody who talked about freedom of speech, for example, would be punished, would be sent to jail, or sent to Siberia, where they would work in mines until they died, or something like that. Promoted strict censorship of the press. He gave the secret police more power. So we told the secret police to arrest anybody that said anything negative about the Tsar. And then you had now, and this probably would have gone on for quite a while, but then the Crimean War broke out. In the Crimean War, Russia really got it handed to them. They really lost pretty badly to Britain and France. And this is not because they didn't have enough soldiers, it's because they didn't have enough supplies for the soldiers they had. Armies were getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and that means you needed lots of clothing, lots of boots, lots of gun, lots of ammunition. This was kind of the joke here, as you see in the political cartoon. The guy says, "Well, Jack, here's good news from home. We're to have a medal." And the guy says, "Well, that's very kind. Maybe one of these days we'll have a coat to stick it on." And that's the thing. The Russian soldiers didn't have enough coats, didn't have enough guns, didn't have enough ammunition. Why didn't they have enough? Well, they didn't have enough because they weren't industrialized. They had no factories to produce these. And you can't hand sew enough coats to provide for an entire army. You can't handcraft enough guns to provide for an entire army. You need factories to make all this stuff. Russia just didn't have that many factories. Britain and France had tons of factories. They had no trouble supplying their armies. Russia had a lot of problems because they didn't have factories. And they weren't going to have factories until they reformed their economy, and they couldn't reform their economy until they reformed their political system. So Nicholas I's oppression kept them from fixing their system. I keep the same picture here. You see Alexander II sitting down in his chair, and his wife, the young man standing behind them, is Alexander III. Alexander II was assassinated. Alexander II was assassinated by radicals who thought he needed more reform. They liked the change, but they wanted a lot more change. And they felt that Alexander II wasn't moving fast enough on change, so they assassinated him. And his son, Alexander III, became the next Tsar. Alexander III's attitude was, can you imagine your father tries to help these poor people, tries to bring about change, and then he's killed? So what's his response going to be? His response is just to reverse direction and say, look, if my father tried to be nice to you people and that's how you treated him, I'm going to crack down. I'm going to be harsh. I'm going to be out to punish people, out to censor people, out to control people. So Alexander II returned to autocracy, restored censorship, increased the power of the secret police. He also decided a lot of the problem was that there were not enough Russians in Russia. There's a lot of other ethnic groups in Russia besides the Russians. So he promoted Russification, which is the idea that if you live in Russia, you should speak Russian and act Russian and follow Russian religious beliefs and so on. Now, the last part, particularly about following Russian religious beliefs, was not supported, obviously, by Jews in Russia, and there were a lot of them. And so a number of pogroms were instituted against Jews, which are these officially sanctioned persecutions. Homes were burned down. Ordinary Jews were just beaten up randomly. It wasn't sort of an organized slaughter like, say, the Holocaust of World War II was, but it was a widespread, officially sanctioned persecution of the Jews. These were known as the pogroms. And one of the reasons Alexander III hated the Jews was because he didn't see them as real Russians, and he didn't trust anyone who was a real Russian, who wasn't a real Russian. Of course, he didn't trust most people that were Russian. So Alexander III dies. His son, Nicholas II, takes over. Nicholas II inconsistently moved between conservatives and liberalism. So Nicholas I was a conservative. He was an autocrat. Alexander II was a liberal. Alexander III moved back to conservatism. He was an autocrat. And then Nicholas II could not seem to make up his mind, so he went back and forth between the two. After the loss in the war with Japan in 1905, Nicholas II got a lot of criticism. I mean, how could Russia lose to an Asian power? I mean, there was a lot of racism involved in this. How could the white people of Russia lose to those Asians, those Japanese, and obviously they blamed the Tsar for this. And so, in order to kind of deal with their anger, he agreed to some reforms. The Marxists were starting to rise and become powerful, and they wanted even more reforms. And when there was an angry protest, when a protest appeared outside of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, somebody, and we don't know whether it was a Tsar or somebody else, ordered the troops to fire on the protesters, and this became known as Bloody Sunday. In response to Bloody Sunday, he tried to go even more reforms and allow for an elected Duma. And then he said, no, you guys can elect people to this Duma, but they can only advise me. They can't actually pass laws I don't like, which is going to make people even more unhappy. So Nicholas II does the worst possible thing. He goes back and forth and back and forth. Can't decide whether or not he's going to be promoting change or not promoting change. And this will end up being disastrous for Russia. It'll be disastrous for Nicholas II. And he will become the last Tsar, as he is and his entire family, which you see in this picture, will be killed by radical communists at the end of World War I.